Welcome back students. So today we are going to talk about the important psychologists. In this photo you can see few of the important psychologists. So we are going to discuss few of them today as per your psychology textbook. The first psychologist that we are going to discuss about is Dr. Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 and was founding the father of psychoanalysis, a method for treating mental illness and also a theory which explains the human behavior. Freud believed that the events in our childhood have great influence on our adult lives, shaping our personality. For example, anxiety originating from traumatic experience in a person's past is hidden from consciousness and may cause problems during adulthood in the form of neurosis. So Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 and he did a most important theory of psychoanalysis which talks about the unconscious mind. According to him, all the issues that we face in our adulthood is because of that. Now we are going to see a video about Sigmund Freud which will give you more idea about him.
Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist and the founder of psychoanalysis, and was born in Freiburg in Moravia, but moved to Vienna with his family in 1857. He was an exceptionally gifted child and an excellent student. He attended medical school in Vienna and became involved in neuropsychology research and studied in Paris and Nancy with some of the most prominent psychologists of the time. After spending some time in Berlin, he returned to Vienna and set up a psychiatric practice. He adopted a new form of treatment with his patients that involved talking about their problems to trigger emotional release, known as repression, which is now widely seen as the basis for psychoanalysis. Freud's theories were well received, but he had many disagreements with other psychologists at the time, most notably the psychologist Carl Jung. In 1923, Freud developed a benign mouth tumor associated with his heavy smoking, which he had to have removed. After the outbreak of World War II, Freud went into exile in Hampstead, London, where he continued his work. In 1939, his mouth tumor returned, and he requested the help of his friend Max Schur to assist him in committing suicide. Schur gave Freud large doses of morphine, which ultimately led to Freud's death. Amongst other achievements, Freud contributed to research into cerebral palsy, psychoanalysis, and investigations into the conscious and unconscious minds of his patients. He also investigated dream interpretation, and was a strong advocate of repression techniques to revisit repressed memories that have been buried or repressed by the patient, as well as psychosexual therapies. Although a controversial figure, Freud's contributions to psychiatry and psychoanalysis have altered the direction and focus of many psychiatric methods and techniques.
Okay. Next we move on to Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov, he was a Russian physiologist, later became psychologist, gave the first behavioral theory of learning called classical conditioning. So in the chapter we have learned what the learning is and what the classical conditioning experiment is about the dog and how the process of association occurs. So Ivan Pavlov became very famous because of his theory of learning called classical conditioning. According to him, learning takes place due to connection established between two stimuli due to the close association, that is learning through association. We will see a video about Ivan Pavlov.
This is Ivan Pavlov. He was born on September 14, 1849, in Ryazan, Russia. His father, Peter Pavlov, was a village priest. He wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, so in 1860 he attended the Ryazan Theological Seminary to become a priest. But then in 1870, Pavlov abandoned his religion career to pursue a career in the sciences. He attended the University of St. Petersburg and studied natural history in the physical sciences department. and in 1875 he graduated with the degree of Candidate of Natural Sciences. Then, with his curiosity in physiology, he attended the Academy of Medical Surgery, but not to become a doctor. He just intended to pursue his physiological studies. After leaving the academy, he studied digestion and circulation for 2 years, and in 1879 he earned his medical degree and then his postdoctoral degree. After receiving these two credentials, Pavlov began to develop his most famous theory. This would eventually be named Pavlov's dog. During the 1890s, Ivan Pavlov researched the salivation of dogs in response to being fed. He noticed the dog would begin to salivate whenever he entered the room, even when he was not bringing it food. This revelation was the beginning of his classical conditioning theory. He began to apply this theory with the use of a bell as the stimulus. This was Pavlov's experiment. Before conditioning, Pavlov would bring his dog food and measure how much it would salivate when it saw the food. During conditioning, Pavlov would ring a bell and bring his dog food, and again measure how much the dog salivated when the food was brought to it. After conditioning, Pavlov would just ring a bell and measure how much the dog salivated. Therefore, Pavlov proved that you could condition a response with a certain stimulus. He believed that a person's behavioral development is strongly affected by conditioned nervous responses to life events, like how the dog's response to the bell was created after it learned that the bell proceeded with food. But with this, he caused a split in the field of psychology. Pavlov's ideas opposed the views of Sigmund Freud. Freud theorized that an individual's thought processes was the driving force behind human behavior. Freudian psychology became the primary approach to mental health treatment, not Pavlov's. But Pavlov maintained his devotion to the importance of conditioned reflexes in human behavior. He applied his theory to the treatment of psychiatric patients, by placing them in a quiet and isolated environment in order to remove any possible psychological or physiological stimuli that might negatively affect or influence their mental health. So how could Pavlov's work help explain modern social situation, and why is he important in our study of the social sciences? Pavlov's work helped to create a new way to study human behavior. It can explain how people with post-traumatic stress disorder can have flashbacks to traumatic events when they see, hear, or smell certain things. Pavlovian training is used in many fields, such as anti-phobia treatment. In this treatment, the patient is taught a technique to calm and relax their muscles. They use this technique while imagining themselves in a fear-producing situation, and over time, they are able to put themselves into the situation and relax because of behavior conditioning. Pavlov's research methods: detailed notes, fieldwork, observation, and collections of stats.
Psychologist we are talking is about Alfred Binet. Alfred Binet was born in July 8, 1857. Born Alfredo Binet was a French psychologist who invented the first practical IQ test, the Binet-Simon test. In 1905, the French Ministry of Education asked the psychologist Alfred Binet to devise a method that would determine which student did not learn effectively from a regular classroom instructions, so they could give him their remedial work. Along with his collaborator Theodore Simon, Binet published revision of his test in 1908 and 1911, the last of which appeared just before his death. So he has done amazing work of IQ test with his collaborator, that is Theodore Simon. Since French Paris school were not aware why some students were lacking in academic, so they asked Binet to find out some solution, and that is when Alfred Binet invented the first practical IQ test for testing the IQ of students. Okay, so I hope you're clear with it. And the first he derived in 1905, and then it was revised in 1908 and 1911. Next psychologist we are talking about is Gordon Elport. You remember his theory that was explained in the personality chapter. Okay, So Gordon Elport was an American psychologist. Elport was one of the first psychologists to focus on the study of personality and is often referred as one of the founding figure of personality psychology. He contributed to the formation of value scales and rejected both psychoanalytic approach to the personality, which he thought often too deeply interpretive, and behavioral approach, which he thought did not provide the deep enough interpretations from their data. Instead of these popular approaches, he developed the eclectic theory based on traits. He emphasized the uniqueness of each individual and the importance of the present context as opposed to the past history for understanding the personality. So, in simple terms, Elport derived the personality theory. He rejected psychoanalytic theory of Freud and behavioral approach of John Watson, and he developed his own theory of personality known as electric theory based upon the traits. So you remember the central, cardinal and secondary traits he developed. So it was the personality theory he developed, and he rejected the other theories. Next psychologist we are talking about is Henry Murray. The other day we talked about the Henry Murray's important invention. Henry Alexander Murray was born in May 13, 1893, was an American psychologist at Harvard University, where from 1959 to 1962 he conducted a series of psychological damaging experiments on undergraduate students, one of whom was Ted Kaczynski, later known as Unbomber. He was director of Harvard Psychological Clinic and School of Arts and Sciences after 1930. Murray developed the theory of personality called personology based on the needs and the press. Murray was also co-developer of Christiania Morgan of thematic perception test, which he referred as the second bestseller that Harvard has ever published, second only to the Harvard Handbook of the Music. So you can see that Murray has done the two most important things. That is, first he developed the theory of personality called as personology, which is based on needs and press, which is not given in your textbook. And second thing that is mentioned in your textbook is his most important invention, that is of thematic perception test, that is a projective technique he developed with the help of Christiania Morgan. So it is a Murray and Morgan developed thematic perception test, that is a projective test, which became a second bestseller after in the Harvard has ever published. Fine, so this was all about the Murray. Next psychologist we talk about is Edward Titchener. Edward Titchener was a student of William Wundt. You remember William Wundt was the first person to establish a psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany ever. So he was a student. He belongs to structuralism school of thought of psychology. So structuralism is one of the major thought or school of psychology, which was started by Edward Titchener. To understand in much more detail, we will see a video about Edward Titchener.
British psychologist who studied under Wilhelm Wundt. Some of Titchener's greatest contributions to psychology were the theory of structuralism, introspection, and stimulus error. Titchener was very focused on the mind and was very known for his type of psychology, which was called structuralism. This was considered the first school of psychology. Since psychology was not recognized in England, Titchener moved to America, and in 1892 he became a professor at Cornell University. This was when Titchener begins to introduce structuralism in the United States. Structuralism focused on the theory of consciousness, which analyzed the mind by studying simple components and how they went together to form a complex experience. It involved 3 steps: to identify the structure of consciousness by first identifying its elements, then to find out how they came about being grouped and arranged, and finally to figure out the causes of the specific arrangement of elements. Structuralism relied on introspection to determine different types of components. Introspection observes a person's thoughts and feelings. In other words, introspection is the observation of a subject and how the subject reacts and describes the object that he or she is presented with. Titchener trained his students and colleagues in his method of introspection according to his ways, which in turn gave structuralism the name of introspective psychology. He also had his own ways when it came to reporting introspective analysis, and it had to be done only that way. He presented a subject with an object, and the subject reported back the characteristics of the pen. The subject had to avoid reporting the name of the presented object because this did not describe what the subject was experiencing. He called this stimulus error. Stimulus error is when the focus is on the meaning or semantic status of the object, but not its properties. Simply put, it confuses the mental process with the object that is being observed. Titchener had many publications and had written textbooks and had other works. He was very well respected. He was the co-editor of the American Journal of Psychology from 1895 to 1920. And the sole editor of it from 1921 to 1925. Titchener died on August 3, 1927 in Ithaca, New York.
Next psychologist we talk about is Max Wertheimer. He was born on April 15, 1880, was an Austro-Hungarian born psychologist, was one of the three founders of Gestalt psychology along with Kurt Kafka and Wolfgang Kohler. Okay, so now these three psychologists were most famous because of their work in Gestalt psychology. Gestalt is related to perception, your chapter for perception. So Gestalt is how human beings do a perception or perceive any object. So according to them, if a person is perceiving any object, he is going to perceive it as a whole object. So that is what the research they all have done in a Gestalt psychology. Next psychologist we talk about is William James. William James is the first educator offer of psychology course in US, earning him a title Father of American Psychology. He is considered as the founder of functionalism school of thought of psychology. So he was the first person to actually start a school or a course in psychology at US, and that is why he has got a title of Father of American Psychology, and he was also the founder of functionalism school of thought. Next we talk about the Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and a founder of analytic psychology. He classified people into two, that is introvert and extrovert. So you can again see the chapter 2 personality, in which you have seen the work of Carl Jung and his theory, right? So these were all the important psychologists that we talked about today. In case if you have any doubts, please feel free to comment in a video and let me know. Bye, take care.